Welcome to Cyber Threat Thursday. I'm Kristin Judge from the Cybercrime Support Network, and I am here with my friend and colleague, Michael Daniel. We want to talk to you today about the SolarWinds Incident, and Michael has been really helpful in writing about this online. You may have seen some of his articles or tweets about it. So I thought it would be important for us to sit down with people and just talk about what happened and how it may be impacting them or not impacting them. So Michael, thank you for joining. I'd love for you to tell people a little bit about the Cyber Threat Alliance, which I call the godfather of ISACs. Start there, a little bit about you, and then we'll start the conversation.
Well, sure. Well, thanks for having me, Kristin. I really always enjoy getting a chance to sit down and talk with you, so I'm happy to be here today. Yeah, I think the Cyber Threat Alliance is really, it's a industry organization that's dedicated to enabling cybersecurity providers to share threat intelligence with each other, and to do that both at speed, at scale, in an automated fashion, and to do it in a human-to-human fashion to foster trust and understanding between providers. So our purpose is really to enable those that are providing cybersecurity services for others. So your cybersecurity vendors, your telecommunication companies, your platform providers, for those kinds of entities to be exchanging threat intelligence. So that's really what CTA is all about. We've been around for almost 4 years now, so we're getting pretty well established. We've got 31 members from 9 different countries headquartered in 9 different countries around the world. So we're definitely growing and are looking to continue that growth.
And we started our companies around the same time after working together when you were in the White House. Can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Sure. So I actually spent 21 and a half years in the federal government. The first part of my career, I was actually at the Office of Management and Budget, which is one of those agencies that a lot of people have never heard of, but actually wields a lot of influence in Washington. And then in about the mid-2000s, I started getting into this new area called cybersecurity, primarily because a couple of federal agencies started spending a fair amount of money on this thing called cyber, and nobody knew what they were spending the money on. And so the director of OMB at the time looked at me and another guy and was like, "You two, go get smart on this cyber thing." And that was how I started down the road. And then the last 4.5 years of my time in the government, I was President Obama's cybersecurity advisor. So I was officially the special assistant to the president and cybersecurity coordinator on the National Security Council staff. So I spent a lot of time working at that intersection of technology, policy, budget, all of those things sort of coming together for cybersecurity.
Yeah, quite a job, and we're looking forward to finding out who will be in similar positions coming up in the next administration. So when the SolarWinds compromise happened, it was announced on December 13th, I believe, by FireEye and Microsoft. And I saw you tweeting about, it's not really an attack. This isn't sort of like the beginning of a war. Would you talk first of all about that? Let's just get those kind of things off the table first, and then we can go deeper down into what actually happened.
Sure. So the reason that I use that is the media often will, and people even in our business will often use the term attack quite loosely. And the truth is that when you think about what you mean when you talk about the word attack in the physical world, like you wouldn't say that, someone who broke into your house and stole some jewelry or some electronics, you wouldn't say they attacked your house. They broke into your house. Yeah. And so the same thing is actually true in cyberspace. The SolarWinds compromise, by everything that has been released so far, appears to be espionage. It appears to have been conducted for the purpose of collecting and exfiltrating, so getting out of systems, collecting information about policies, upcoming events, for a whole variety of things. It's going to take us quite some time to figure out all of what was potentially compromised in that way. But it wasn't destructive. It wasn't, disruptive. It didn't steal intellectual property to benefit Russian companies, for example. So that's why I am very careful to not use the word attack in terms of what actually happened, because we should reserve that word, that terminology, for when there are destructive effects, when there are disruptive effects, and that sort of thing. Now, that doesn't mean it's not.
Yeah. So could they use the information they just took, though, for an attack?
Sure. So you can take that information and you can weaponize it, right? And use that in some form. It could turn out that they actually left tools behind that could turn into an attack. So that's why I'm very careful to also say, based on what we know right now, right?
Sure.
And just because I don't use the word attack doesn't mean that it is not incredibly significant. This may be the most significant compromise the U.S. federal government has ever faced in cyberspace, and so the terminology does not determine its severity in that sense. And so it's very important that this is that people understand that this responding to this incident should be an incredibly high priority for the government, and it appears to be for the agencies that are involved. And it can have some very, very damaging effects on our national security over the long run. And in fact, one of the efforts that the government is going through right now in the background is in the wake of any kind of compromise like this, the government will do what's called a damage assessment. And so they are working their way through trying to understand what the adversary, in this case, the Russians, what they could have gotten access to, and what the potential damage is from the information that they may have collected. And it could be quite serious from a national security standpoint.
Yeah, and not even from a government standpoint, but we know that many of the Fortune 500 were also hit. So you combine the government data with the private sector data, and that can even potentially do more damage. So I know a lot of people listening, though, don't even really understand what the SolarWinds compromise was. Would you put it in layman's terms for people that watch this show and say what actually happened? Just give us the 30,000 view of what happened.
Yeah, and it's interesting because whenever you see reporting about compromises or hacks, they're almost always reported as sophisticated. And to be fair, no one wants to say that they were the victim of a unsophisticated attack, right? But the truth is that this one was actually, in fact, deserves that term, sophisticated, and not just from a technical standpoint, but from an operational standpoint, from an organizational standpoint. So the short recap version of the way that this compromise worked is that some set of the adversary, which the U.S. government has attributed to the Russian government, and I believe that attribution makes sense. So these actors gained access to a company called SolarWinds. How they gained that access is either still not known, or the company has not disclosed that publicly yet. But they used that access to SolarWinds to inject malicious code into a product that SolarWinds sells to an enormous number of companies and government agencies around the world. And this product is called Orion. And what it does is, if you run a large network, with thousands of machines and printers and servers and other kinds of devices, you need some way to manage that large network of devices. And Orion is what's called a network management software. So it helps you actually maintain and operate all of that IT equipment in an optimal form. And the actors very, very stealthily managed to figure out a way to insert code into the Orion product as it was being built by the company. So as they were working on a new version of their product, the bad guys actually inserted some lines of code into that product. And they did it in a way that the SolarWinds developers and engineers couldn't even detect that their product had been tampered with. That alone was a pretty
sophisticated.
Yes, that was a pretty sophisticated set of coding and engineering right there.
Yeah.
once that product was, so that inserted code is something that we typically refer to as a Trojan, because it goes into a network and allows you to get access, kind of like the Trojan horse.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
So once that product was compromised, then when a user would update their version of the Orion product, they would also get this malicious code. And this Trojan would then do some reconnaissance on the network. Well, actually, it would sit quietly for a couple of weeks, which is actually really interesting.
And smart, yeah, so that it can't be noticed necessarily.
Yeah. And then it would do some reconnaissance, and it would contact the outside world based on some decision rules that it had. And it would encode certain kinds of information about the network and the machine where it had landed. And if the bad guys were interested in it, if it landed someplace that they were interested in, then they would do some follow-on exploitation of that Trojan. If they weren't interested in it, they would just kill it, and it would remove itself because it wasn't someplace that they wanted to take the time or had any interest in. And then from there, what they would do is they would use some custom malware that means that it doesn't share any relationship to known other malware that's out there, which is extremely unusual.
Again, sophisticated.
Very sophisticated.
Right? Yeah.
Shows a lot of patience and resources that went into it. And then they would build out from there. And typically what the adversary would do is they would want to gain access to legitimate credentials. So meaning that they would gain access so that they could come in and look like an employee or a regular user of whatever organization that they were penetrating. And then once they did that, they would eliminate the backdoor and the other access so that you couldn't detect it.
So you were already in there looking like something that's supposed to be in there.
Correct.
And so we may not even know that they're in there because they haven't left a footprint in a lot of places.
Correct. And then they would move around the network and look to gain, lateral. They would do what we call lateral movement. So they're moving around the network, looking to establish other access points, gain credentials, and then collect information and get it out of the network. And all of this, is part of the reason why the degree of stealth, the degree of obfuscation that they would go through to hide their activities. All of those things are why, the general consensus is that so far this is about espionage. This is not a criminal actor looking to make money. This is a nation state looking to conduct spying.
Yeah.
So it's it really is quite an impressive operation from an organizational standpoint, from a patience standpoint. It does appear that the initial compromise in SolarWinds dates back to at least September of 2019.
Oh my goodness.
And then, the compromised versions of Orion went out starting in March of 2020 and lasted through essentially this past fall.
So someone had a lot of patience and a lot of labor went into this, it sounds
Correct.
like to me. I'm picturing a lot of people had to be a part of this system.
Yes. Okay. Certainly a fair number, and they had to be very patient and willing to invest a lot of time. And there was a lot of hands-on keyboard work once they were actually inside.
Right, deciding what they want to stay in, what they don't want to stay in. I mean, when you were saying that, I'm thinking that's labor intensive. And if someone's a typical cyber criminal that does things like romance scams, they want to get in, get some money, and get out. Yeah. They're not going to spend all this time waiting for a payoff. And there really hasn't been a quote unquote payoff of money right now. So that shows you again, it's about something else.
That's right. That's right.
Okay. Now, does this impact in some way the federal government or even private sector coming together and say, what other software or vendors do we work with that everybody works with? Maybe we need to have something similar to, not having a monopoly in some kind of verticals. Maybe we have to make sure that there's enough of these network managing companies so that everybody isn't using the same one. Is there something else that everybody's using the same one that could have this kind of impact? Because that I think was part of the issue, is that they were a good company, obviously, everybody was using them, but is there something else? Should we be looking at, is there something else that everyone's using? Don't say if you know there is one, but should we be looking at that?
Sure. I mean, you're always wanting to look at single points of failure. I mean,
that's the word. Thank you.
I think that is actually one of the purposes of the National Risk Management Center, which is part of the Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. One of its jobs is to try to assess risk at a systemic level across the U.S. And to look for those kinds of things. It's challenging because, of course, a lot of companies, for very good reason, not real keen on just happening to tell the government all the software they use,
right.
Which I can understand. So I think that there's, we're going to have to continue ways to try to understand the ecosystem better, to understand where we might have those kinds of, amalgamations of usage of software. I think some of the other things are that there has to also be, when you do contracting, I think it's going to change how the federal government thinks about doing its contracting. And you've seen this with the Department of Defense.
Yeah, the supply chain issues and the vendor checklists. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and starting to put in this cybersecurity maturity model.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And I think you're going to see more of that as a result of this.
Do you think all the supply chain cyber issues that I know people have been working on supply chain and cybersecurity for many years, but I don't feel like it ever fully got its attention that it needed. And so do you think the compromise will help push us further on the supply chain work that we're doing to make sure that we have things that are made in America, maybe by Americans with American technology, that we're plugging into things like NSA and CIA and that kind of thing? Do you think this will help to move that forward?
I think the supply chain threat and supply chain risk management is one of the most complex areas that I dealt with when I was in government. It continues to be. I think one of the reasons it's so slow is because it is so complex.
Yeah.
And I also think that when you start talking provenance of materials, it gets even more complex. I mean, it's like, it's kind of like we say these days, like, well, okay, so supposedly that's an American versus Japanese car, for example, but that Honda may well have been assembled in Tennessee, and that GM was actually mostly assembled in Mexico.
Yeah.
So I think what's really more important are efforts like what you've seen with the software bill of materials, right? Where there's this effort to go to create a format so that you can say, all right, what's the provenance of my software? Who coded it? Where did it come from? What libraries is it drawing from? What open source pieces of software went into making this thing? So that you can actually start to look at that from a risk management standpoint.
Almost like an ingredients list that we get on a box of cereal. So look, this is where it came from. And we don't really have that right now. Vendors people that are purchasing software have to just have their own vendor checklists to ask the right questions. Not everybody is really asking all the right questions. Is that something you can assume?
Yep, that's right. And so this, will help with some of that.
Yeah,
I also think transparency. Some of the transparency, it will help with that risk management.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the other issues, Kristin, that I really think about though too is one of the challenges with this is that for most people, most consumers, frankly, even all the way up to fairly large businesses, like supply chain is not their number one threat. Okay. If you are, the CISO for a mid-sized company someplace, your number one threat is still ransomware, right? It's still those kinds of things. It's not the supply chain.
And that's from phishing. I mean, that's just making sure someone doesn't click on something. It's that simple. Yeah.
And so I think that's another reason why this has always been so difficult, is that it's one of those things it's an example of one of those low probability but high impact events, right? So
which doesn't always get the budget or the time.
Right.
Yeah.
And it also makes it challenging because, in fact, actually, the majority of your risk is actually sitting somewhere else, right? And you can't take your eye off of doing the basics of, good password management and multi-factor authentication and, all of those, keeping your software up to date and all those basics. Like, you can't take your eye off of that.
Right.
To worry about this very esoteric risk that's probably is not going to materialize most of the time.
Right.
So that's also one of the challenges with this area. And I hope that we actually don't completely over rotate on it.
And have too much of a reaction that takes away from what people really need to be paying attention to more.
Yeah, because that's where the majority of the threats and the majority of the economic damage is coming. Now, obviously, if you're a federal agency, like, you
need to overcorrect. Yeah.
That's a different story.
Okay.
But,
now, why is SolarWinds important to people like me and other consumers or small businesses?
Well, I think it's, it continues to highlight that there is systemic risk here in addition to your individual risk, right? And that is one of the things that makes cybersecurity so challenging from a public policy standpoint, which is that not all of the risk is private, that there is risk that is shared among all of us. And the penetration and the compromise of one entity in the ecosystem can result in the compromise and penetration of a whole bunch of different entities across the ecosystem.
Right.
And so
we're all interconnected. I mean, the weakest link issue is really an issue here, because if I send you something and you send it to 20 other people, we could have just infected 20 companies. It takes 10 minutes. Yeah. Yeah.
And so that's what I think for most people, that's the importance of SolarWinds, is that reminder that there's a lot of shared risk here. And so if we're talking about shared risk, then that means that we've got to have some public means of dealing with that risk in addition to the private means that we're used to. I also think that, it's a good reminder. The other lesson that I would say that you should take from SolarWinds is that if you are facing a dedicated adversary that is willing to be patient, that is willing to put a lot of person hours into, hacking into you, it is going to be almost impossible to keep them from gaining some level of access to your network. Yeah. And so the lesson from that is that it's also important to have your incident response plan.
That's right.
What are you going to do when you have a cyber incident? And how can you try to make sure that the impact of that incident is minimized on your company, or, if you're a consumer, on your family? Making sure that you contain and minimize the damage is really, that's really the important thing.
Yeah, I remember when I started in cybersecurity 12 years ago, it was every conference you went to, it was all about the perimeter and preventing an attack. And then about 6 or 7 years later, it started being, okay, you're going to be attacked here. Now it's about who's going to recover and have the resiliency after the fact. I saw this huge shift of people saying, okay, yes, you have to put all that stuff in place, but we're not talking about necessarily preventing anymore. We're talking about who's going to be able to survive after it happens. And that was a pretty noticeable, switch for me.
Yeah, and I think that goes along with this idea that I talk about and that's why I always use the term risk management, because this is not about, you can't solve your cybersecurity problem. You're gonna manage your cybersecurity risk, and you're going to do things that reduce that risk, right? And so you're going to put in place those perimeter protections. You're going to put in place endpoint protections. You're going to do those things, but some of the time that's going to fail. And so you're also going to have your plan for what do I do when that fails, so that you minimize the damage from that failure. And that's important for any kind of organization to do. And it doesn't have to be complex.
Yeah.
So
are we seeing any impacts right now from SolarWinds yet? And then what kind of impacts might we start seeing in the future?
Well, I think, one of the interesting things about it is that if it really if again, if you come back to for all intents and purposes, it appears to be espionage right now. Right. The impacts may actually be hard to discern because the point of it from the Russian perspective was to collect information. And for the most part, that went into their government for their decision-making purposes. So discerning the effect of that may be challenging. But I think, so you're not likely to see much of the way of those kinds of impacts. Where I think you will see impacts is in places like if you deal with government contracting or you have government contracts. I think you're going to see more requirements for you to demonstrate your how you're meeting how you're doing good cybersecurity.
And that's okay. I'm okay with that. I like that idea. I think it's all right because we are one chain.
Yeah. So I think that's the place where you'll see, probably the most change. I think there will be, some additional scrutiny on, places that provide these kinds of network management software. So, there'll probably be some, I wouldn't be surprised if some vulnerabilities and other things start cropping up in this network management software space, because what tends to happen is that, now there'll be a lot more people looking at that kind of software and they'll find stuff. So we'll probably see more media reports about vulnerabilities in network management software. And that's just because it'll, it's drawn attention. So those are the kinds of effects I think you'll see, in terms of what businesses might see as a result of the SolarWinds intrusion.
But as an individual, unlike Target or something where my personal information was stolen, that's really not what's happening here that we know of at this point, but things could change. We could find out more, correct?
That's right. I mean, this is going to take a long time to unravel, and we still don't have a good sense of, for the private sector side, we know that they, did gain access to, a certain number of companies. We don't know exactly how many. Not a gigantic number, but, a sizable number, but we don't know what happened there. But
are the companies coming out and all working together to say, hey, let's get together on a SolarWinds, commission and say what happened to each company? Are they doing that yet? Do you know?
So I don't know about that. I mean, certainly among the Alliance, we are sharing as much information on what we know about the technical indicators, how you could find evidence of intrusions, how you could, identify whether or not your network was compromised. That kind of information is being exchanged very, very aggressively and rapidly within CTA, for example.
Great.
I think that, but you're right. For the moment, Kristin, I would say that, if you're for an individual, right now, you're not likely to see much in the way of compromise there or impact, just because that was not the point of what was going on.
Okay, and we put in the links a link to Cyber Threat Alliance, which is your organization. And then we also put a link to an article that you wrote so people could read a little bit more about it. And I encourage people to follow you on Twitter. What's your Twitter handle?
at Alliance Prez.
Okay, there we go. All right, well, thank you so much, Michael. As always, we could talk for hours. It's such a pleasure to have this discussion. Thank you. I learned a lot about SolarWinds. I appreciate you helping putting it in the terms that I can understand, and hopefully a lot of other people. We appreciate all the service you've given our country and are still giving our country. And thank you for joining us on Cyber Threat Thursday. I'm Kristin Judge, the founder of the Cybercrime Support Network. And I am here at 3:05 Eastern most Tuesdays for Cyber Tip Tuesday. And then I bring on amazing guests like Michael on Thursdays. So hope you'll follow me on LinkedIn and stay safe. Thank you so much, Michael.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.